Hello and welcome to the Innovative Ministry Center. My name is Tay Moss, and I made this video to teach you how to think about church communications. This is based on a presentation that I usually give in person, and it's quite dense with information, so feel free to pause the video at any time to read the text or explore the charts. Let's get started. I titled this talk, "The Via Media is the Massage," in a nod to Marshall McLuhan. He was a Canadian media theorist and critic who was able to prophesy about the future of the digital world in ways that are quite stunning to read in retrospect. He famously had the adage that the medium is the message. And he also understood more than any of the thinkers of his time about how, although we might think of communications as we have a message that we want to convey to others, and we use these as tools, these communication methods, the truth is that the communication methods themselves then shape not just the message that they convey, but also us as the tool users. A little bit about myself. I am the incumbent, which means the priest, at the Church of the Messiah, which is an Anglican church in downtown Toronto. I'm also the coordinator of the Innovative Ministry Center, which is a project of the Toronto United Church Council. I'm an American originally. I moved to Canada about 15 years ago. All the content here is Creative Commons. I would like to be cited, and I would not like you to use this for commercial purposes, please. One place to begin would be to wonder why it's even necessary to give a talk like this. Most people that I teach feel themselves to already be pretty media literate because they live in a media-saturated environment. The point of these two charts down below is just basically to show that, yes, the internet is a thing and it's growing quite rapidly, especially when you look at technologies like mobile access to communications. Everybody's got a smartphone now. The other thing that might come across for a lot of people is this idea that, isn't this stuff obvious? I mean, why do we really need a lecture about how to communicate with people using social media or other means? And, don't we know we just need to put in more cats to get the laughs and get engagement? Maybe. I think there are some challenges that are particular to church communications, which you wouldn't necessarily come up with without a lot of reflection and thought. One of which is just to notice how we are living in an attention economy, which privileges the sensational, the novel, and the shallow, all of which would seem to go against the core tenets of what the Christian message is meant to evoke for people. Another thing that we might notice right away is the way that media has become fragmented across different channels. And yet, so you see even now things like streaming services. It used to be there was only one or two names in that space. And now you've got Netflix competing against CBS All Access and the Disney Channel and so forth. So there's always this fragmentation or increasing fragmentation around media. And yet, as much as we see the rise of all these new types of digital communication, it's also true that print media is not dead yet. And so it's not that the old has been entirely replaced by the new, but rather just the whole media landscape becomes more and more complex. Another thing that's particular about church communications is that usually you have limited resources to do it. At least in the churches that I have worked in and know, there's very limited resources to put into communications. And usually, however, there are unlimited expectations because people's expectations of what church media should look like are shaped by the kind of media influence of, television and YouTube and so on. And they think that, why can't we make it look like that, right? We also have to realize that we get very little feedback in our churches usually about how we're doing. Most people are too polite to tell us when we've made mistakes. And so you might have a video up for like weeks and then suddenly somebody sends you an email and they just assume that you knew that there was some glaring typo in it. Another thing particular to church communications is that we get more than our fair share of trolls. People who are just trying to get a rise out of others on the internet and will do it by attacking your content. We also have to acknowledge that there's a fair amount of bullshit in church communications. There's a lot of people that are trying to sell false narratives about the world and about God and so forth, and wacky theories and theologies, and isn't everybody's beliefs the same and that kind of thing. So cutting through the noise can be kind of difficult. But my goal for this session is to give you a few smooth stones to throw at the windows of understanding. So stone number one, know your audience. After all, who are you talking to? I believe it's important to profile both your existing audience and your aspirational one. That is, who do you have listening to you now, and who do you want to listen to you in the future? And to go a step further and even treat that aspirational audience as a kind of mission field. Like, in the old days, we used to send missionaries to foreign lands. Well, in some ways, places like Instagram and corners of Reddit could be a foreign place with its own distinct culture and language and customs. And if we're going to send people into that space to try to reach those people, we need to learn those methods of communication. It's also true that we can profile people based on their media habits. For example, are they primarily people that communicate by email, by phone, by text, by printed newsletters? Are they present on social media? So if we begin to understand where our people are at, we can reach them better with our strategies. Another really important insight to understand is where they are kind of on the Jesus road, and also the kind of normal development curve of human life. So this chart right here gives you a sense of how the different generations by generational cohort break down in terms of how they like to give and receive feedback, what kind of technologies they prefer, what kind of styles of learning that they might have. Now, of course, this isn't a universal thing. It's not true of everyone, but it gives you sort of a general sense of how different the different generations can be and how you might want to reach them. This chart too gives a sense of kind of where people in the cycle of coming to faith might land in terms of the kind of language they might use and the kind of social media strategies that might reach them. So Twitter, for example, might be a really good place to have very relatively light kinds of conversation with people, but if you want to really move them deeply in faith, you're probably going to have to use content that can methods that can carry a lot more content. This is what I mean a little bit later. So number 2, know your message. So one thing to understand is whether what you're trying to do is make an announcement or you're trying to genuinely invite people to something that your church is doing. Another message distinction to make or axis to understand is moments versus movements. That is, are you trying to bring people to something where they'll experience a moment with you, something of joy or something of delight or contemplation, or are you inviting them to be a part of your movement as a church as you try to carry on that influence outside of your church walls? Another way I think of this would be the difference between people that come as just a spectator to a sport and people who are being invited to put on some pads and go to work. Another thing to understand in your message is what are your core values as a community, and to be honest about those, with yourselves at least internally. And another important thing to know about your message is how to use yourself, like self-disclosure, when you're communicating things. So people these days expect authenticity, and that's primarily understood in emotional terms. We're talking about empathy. It's got the feels so much. And we know authenticity when we come across it, and it has a very kind of difficult to describe quality, which we recognize. And it becomes very important, especially in the online world, because self-disclosure becomes a kind of currency of intimacy. It's what we pay in order for people to engage at a deep level with what we're trying to share. The problem is that if you overuse your currency of authenticity by self-disclosure, then you also impoverish your mystique, and that people who become over familiar with you or feel like you're sharing too much are going to be off-put by that as well. Another thing to recognize is that being vulnerable makes you vulnerable, right? I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but it's true that, you might share, say, pictures of your kids and have people respond to that with trollish comments or things that make you uncomfortable or unhappy. So you have to be kind of aware of that when you go into it. You need to also be aware when you're doing self-disclosure not to tell stories that are not yours to tell. For example, it's probably not a good idea for a male pastor to tell stories about his wife's birthing experience. That's not your story to tell. That's your wife's story to tell. And it can go, of course, the other way too. Another thing to keep in mind with the disclosure of self is that there's no delete button on the internet. Not really. You might delete a post that turned out to be oversharing, but the truth is somebody will have taken a snapshot of that and they might share it at some inopportune time in the future. So be a little bit careful about what you share. Be prepared to apologize frequently. The more self-disclosure you use, the more likely you are to trigger someone or to say something which was misinterpreted. So be prepared to apologize and take responsibility for what you say. But ultimately, this question of self ought to be fairly familiar to us from non-communications questions about the kind of vocation of what we're doing as ministers in the church. Specifically, what is a priest anyway? I mean, what is your model of what you're there to do in the community? These are several suggestions of possible paradigms or models of what your priesthood could look like, or your ministry, but none of these are absolute, of course, and none of these are really wrong either. So do you consider yourself to be a kind of sage on the stage, somebody who's gone off and come to great insight about the scriptures or about life or theology or God, and you want to come back and kind of expound upon the learnings that you've had? That's a valid model. Another model might be the mystic monk, the kind of character who is kind of constantly praying, has this kind of deep holiness of life, and people want to kind of hear and be with and in the presence of that holiness. A rebel with a reason. This is the kind of folks that align with social justice kinds of causes, who are trying to motivate others to see how the kingdom could be lived out in the world. The shaman with a secret. It's kind of similar to the mystic monk, but the shaman with a secret it kind of implies a little bit more of an edge of kind of prophetic or mystical kind of like power than the mystic monk. It's rare, but I've seen this type. Another is the pilgrim on the path, which is ministers and priests who present themselves as being just another person in the crowd on their way towards Jesus. Right? Now, again, none of these is a wrong way to think about what ministry is, but it's important to be able to articulate which of these models you might find under, because the choice that you make along these different spectrums will constrain your ministry, both offline and online. So we've talked about authenticity. I would also make a caveat to be aware of the so-called brand Jesus effect. So the problem with brand Jesus is that we can collapse the life of Christian discipleship into a series of consumer life choices, similar to going to the gym or buying only organic food, and that we construe our relationship in a transactional way, and that can lead to the heresy of Pelagianism, which is a fancy term for believing that our salvation is achieved by the means of our own human effort. So in other words, if we collapse brand Jesus into just a series of choices that you make, or books that you read, or going to the right church, or whatever, we run the danger of suggesting that we somehow control God's grace. So don't do that. Some other insights. Show, don't tell. As much as you can demonstrate the Christian life or the message you wish to convey, you're going to have more success than if you just try to explain what it is. Broadcast versus conversation. There are times for both. You sometimes want to do a thing on behalf of the community and broadcast it out there for them to watch by kind of passive participation and reception. But there's other times when you want to invite the community into a conversation. And so to understand the appropriateness of those different tools at different times. But one of the most important lessons to know is that most people outside the church consider Christianity as to be untrue, irrelevant, and boring. So whatever content that you create, which is intended to reach outside your church particularly, is very important that you right away defeat all three of these expectations. That what you say must be relevant to people's lives, it must be true, and it must be non-boring. Stone number 3. Building your team. You might want to think in terms of spaces you wish to occupy in the communications world rather than channels to fill. And then once you kind of have that insight that you're not just trying to fill up a channel on YouTube or on Twitter or a podcast, but rather you're trying to occupy the space of the people who watch YouTube videos, that you want to engage in the space of people who like to listen to podcasts, then you immediately are entering into a more social understanding of what you're trying to do. So if you want to develop a podcast, it might be a good idea to find out who in your congregation listens to a lot of podcasts. Right? That's a very different approach than asking who in my congregation knows how to use a microphone. You want to privilege social engagement over production. Always. If you have a choice between getting more people involved and having a high quality production, always go for social engagement. A good example of that is, go back to the podcast example. Let's say your church is blessed to have some good monetary resources. You might be tempted to hire a producer who's going to do your podcast from soup to nuts, and all you got to do as the minister is show up and talk into the microphone. That's one approach, and it's very efficient, and it will give you a high production value. The opposite, a social engagement method, would be to put together a team of people in your congregation that maybe works with somebody that you've hired from the outside to get that extra little polish. But generally speaking, you're going to privilege the social engagement of a team of people over one single producer who comes in and does it all for you. Another question to occupy yourselves with is, how pro can you go? Like, I believe that the better tools you use will make it more efficient for you to get your message out and to engage people in the media landscape. So for example, if you're talking about creating print documents, it might be worthwhile to invest in the Adobe suite of applications such as Photoshop and InDesign. If you're doing a website, my recommendation would be to go with WordPress, because it's one of the most universal content management systems for website design out there, and looks like everybody knows how to use it. Similarly, if you're doing video production, if you can afford it, go with Adobe. The Premiere Pro is excellent video editing software, or Final Cut, which is popular with people using Macs especially. But there's lots of other editing software out there, but generally speaking, the higher quality that you can go in the tool, the more efficiency you'll have and the more capabilities that it'll have. The other thing to occupy you is the idea of creating workable workflows, which means that you need to have your communication system in your church operate with as much efficiency as possible. And you do that by creating alignments. So a good example might be if you're creating a Sunday leaflet. In the act of doing that, you'll have created perhaps a PDF that gets printed out. Well, maybe that PDF can then be shared on the website. And then maybe that page on the website could have a link going to it from Twitter, right? So we create a workflow where you have an alignment between the content that's created and sharing it in these different spaces. Stone number 4, how to then pitch your tent. One of the things that you need to be worried about in your parish to start off with. One is that you have to have some of these essentials covered off. You have to have good external signage for your church. You have to have a thought out phone greeting on your answering machine, for the church. You have to have some kind of a leaflet or thing you hand out. Even if you're a church which relies on PowerPoint and screens, you need to think about literature that you can hand out to people who are not engaged by screens. So that could be a simple pamphlet that you hand out, which is, it's the same pamphlet week to week, but it has the contact information for the church. It maybe has a few notes about how worship is conducted that people might need, that kind of thing. And these days you do need a website. It does not need to be a complicated website. It does not need to be a website which changes all the time. It could just be a very basic one-page website, but it needs to answer certain questions such as, where is the church? What time is worship? Is there any kids activities going on? And how do I contact people for more information? I mean, really, that is what most people go to church websites looking for. Once you've covered that off, then there's the optional stuff that you might want to consider doing with your time and treasure. One is Facebook, another is Twitter. Another would be to have some kind of a blog, or maybe posting your videos of your sermons, or even doing mail drops to your neighborhood. I consider these all optional because you'd have to have a lot of resources of time and treasure to be able to do all these things, but you can pick one or two. This is a chart just showing some of the different media channels that are available and some of the differences and pluses and minuses of things like Pinterest versus Twitter versus Facebook. And you might want to freeze this and take a look at it if you want to read some of the notes in this. Then there's some advanced level stuff that you can do as a church. One is live streaming, which of course has become incredibly popular with COVID. But it's something we should probably consider doing after COVID's over. Paid advertising, whether that's on Facebook, which makes it very easy to buy advertising, or Twitter, or even a bus sign, a bus stop near your church. Paid advertising is an advanced level thing you might consider doing. Creating advanced print materials. I'm thinking of like flyers and postcards and things like that. And as I said before, sermon videos, cutting out your sermons from your live streams and posting them separately. I would consider that to be an advanced level practice if you're good at it. Some notes and observations to make. Don't commit, especially initially, to trying to manage too many simultaneous channels. It's much better to pick just a few and do them well than it is to try to spread your message thin across a wide variety of channels. Second, once you do take up a channel, feeding the media monster can be relentless. You always feel like you have to update update the content because it just gets buried. And this is especially true in some applications like Twitter. Nobody looks at a tweet that is, older than a couple of hours typically, unless they're searching for a term or something. So you feel like you constantly need to add content to it, to your streams, and that can be a bit relentless. So in order to overcome that relentless feeling, you need to learn how to feed the beast scraps, which, to put it another way, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You just need to get efficient at putting content out there that's true to you and acceptable, rather than trying to get everything perfect and right every time. Next, there's a famous saying that content is king. That was the idea that, getting an audience would follow having good content that people want to see. And, so people might think that the way to make, a popular YouTube channel might be to spend a lot of time on creating the best possible video with the deepest kind of content. And that can be true. And there's definitely some YouTube channels that I follow because I find that the thought that goes into the episodes is just so very good and so very interesting. On the other hand, there's a lot of engagement in the social media landscape, which is incredibly shallow. Basically, you take a picture of a cat doing a cute thing and you can get 1 million follows. So why is this the case? I mean, why does there seem to be this kind of appetite for the most kind of shallow material? Well, I think it comes down to the fact that all communications in some way are attempts to be aspirational. That there's a kind of existential self-expansion that happens when you look at a picture of someone that you admire, or you hear some funny story about somebody that kind of takes them down a peg or something. In other words, that a lot of media is this kind of invitation to kind of lose yourself in the image of another. That's one aspect of this. Another aspect of why the kind of shallow meme-based kind of content works is because it's a representation of a logic rather than an actual representation of an object, right? So it's not really a picture of a cat. It's a picture of Grumpy Cat, and it creates a certain kind of delight. And after a certain point, that becomes a meme, and it's evocative of every other association that's happened with Grumpy Cat. You get what I mean? So it becomes kind of iconographic. These images on memes become icons of a truth, and it's a relatable truth. Like Grumpy Cat is relatable. That image you might have seen of the guy walking with his girlfriend and looking over his shoulder at another woman, that famous meme, that's another example of a kind of iconographic representation of a logic, and it's evocative and it's relatable, and then people just swap out what it's actually referring to make their meme. So another thing to recognize is that static doesn't mean dead. Just because you have set your website up and you put some content on there that you consider to be evergreen and you leave it for a year, that doesn't mean that that's dead content. Oh, come on. Static doesn't mean dead. What I mean by that is that even when you have a static website, which doesn't have a lot of renewed content on it, it nonetheless can be very engaging. If you replace the pictures on a fairly frequent basis, then people will get a sense of what your community looks like, for example, even if it's only a yearly snapshot. The next piece of advice is to get the best smartphone that you can barely afford. Get the nicest phone because it'll have the nicest camera and will be the easiest to create media on. I've already talked about not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good. Note, you can get what you can pay for. If you do have money to spend on a media budget, you can certainly hire somebody to make nice looking graphics, to make you a kind of brand identity with a logo. You can pay for a really beautiful website. You can pay for somebody to manage your social media for you if you like, if you have that kind of money. Most churches don't. People want to engage with people, not institutions. I mean, with a few rare exceptions, most people are not going to find it very compelling that your church has put out its worship service on YouTube. Like, that in itself is not really the draw. But they might be attracted to a picture of a young acolyte doing something cute with candles, right? Like they're going to be drawn to the people, not the institution. I believe that it's an important principle to share the microphone, the voice of your church, amongst the people. In other words, pass the microphone around, make sure that a diversity of voices from your community are being heard. But always remember that you, as the minister, are really the host of this party, and that you need to manage the conversation and make sure that it stays within the guardrails of politeness and respect for others and heresy and things like that. And remember to dance with the one that brought you. You are representing your church if you're a minister, and you need to always think about what you're doing as reflecting upon that institution and that community. So don't get too sidetracked by trying to kind of create a little miniature cult of personality around the things that you share. This part of the presentation, I had some interesting examples to look at of institutions and people that I thought were doing social media communications for the church particularly well. One is the Meeting House. It is I believe it's still the largest church in Southern Ontario, if not the largest in Canada. And they've got a bunch of campuses. They meet in movie theaters, and they have a very good kind of social media presence, which is not surprising because they have the money to pay for it. On the other end of the spectrum is the Weekly Bread, which was a newsletter that I put together to support a food security project that the church has been supporting for a long time. And so I created this all myself in InDesign using a template. And I called myself an editor, and what that really meant was just I'd send out emails bugging people for articles until they sent them to me, and then I'd put those articles in this newsletter. And it would include things like a guide to a vegetable of the week, and it would include recipes that I had gotten from members of the church community and the food security building that we were going towards. And then I would always find a little kids activity to put on the back page, and we would hand this out at our events. Another example of something that is not actually as time consuming as you might think is creating this really nice full service leaflet that I do for my church. So this is printed out on legal size paper, folded in half, which is then stapled in half to make a little booklet. And it has everything, including the lyrics and the music and the prayers. And it also includes these kind of marginal notes off to the side, which is a place where I can put commentary on the scripture, where I can put notes about particular worship or rituals that we're doing in that season. I put announcements and a calendar on the back. And, this is a template. I mean, I built the template over years, just kind of modifying it here and there. But by and large, when I'm making this leaflet on a Sunday, it's really just copy paste stuff. It's really not that difficult. I even have stuff here that I wrote about the saints that might be celebrated in the particular week. To be accurate, this is actually coming from a book which is For All the Saints, which was written by Father Reynolds many years ago. And, people actually love this content, these kinds of little things about the saints. And it's funny because I include them mostly as a way so they don't have to print blank pages. Because as you know, if you're doing a book fold, brochure or something, you end up with having to do a divisible by 4 number of pages. So you're either doing 4 or 8 or 12 pages. So if I end up with an 11-page leaflet, I need to fill some space. So these kinds of bios of saints is a good way to do that. I'm not going to play this, but this is a video that I created for the Anglican Church of Canada to meditate on the Sundays leading up to and including Easter through Lent. And, I shot these all. I didn't get paid anything for this project. I was able to find the time to do it. It actually wasn't that bad or time consuming. And I think the videos are quite beautiful. So the series is called Watchmen for the Morning, and you can take a look at it later and you can see what's possible to do with basically no budget. I think, one of the very few things I paid for was the music rights to play some of the music that appears in the series. I also I paid an actress / dancer to do the scenes here in the Easter Vigil thing, but it was very cheap. It was really not an expensive investment. This is, if I was to play this for you, it would be an example of the live worship stream from my church. Again, I have very few volunteers supporting that. I'm able to basically just do that, on my own. This is an example of a Twitter account, which I think is particularly well done, that keeps the conversation going and engages thousands of people with a Christian message. This is a good example. This is from St. Paul's Bloor Street of how to do a Facebook page for a church. Now, Facebook, you can do some basic things like announce upcoming events, but you also need to understand its usefulness for engaging in conversation. For example, this post provoked this comment. I'm not a member of this parish. I was born and raised Catholic, but have become disabled and walk with great difficulty. Last year, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I was walking by St. Paul's Bloor Street, so I dropped in to ask them to have a mass said for my mother. The receptionist asked me if I was a member of the church, and when I informed her that I was not, going here. Informed her that I wasn't. She told me that since I wasn't a member of their parish, they couldn't have a mass said for my mother. It is my opinion that someone comes to the church and asks for help, whether they are a member or not, Jew or Catholic or Muslim, Hindu or Sikh, or an atheist, that the church should help them. This experience left a very poor taste in my mouth. I have never stepped foot in that church again after this. All right, now this is an example of what they would call in the communications industry, perhaps they would call it something like service recovery. The truth is, this person did not post that comment on this page unless they wanted or were open to some kind of engagement from the church. So instead of getting defensive about a comment like this or trying to just delete it right away, you might want to delete it, but you also might want to follow up with that person and reach out to them, because there's an opportunity here for reconciliation and for relationship to be created. So yeah, so when you get those kind of comments, don't just ignore them. This was a Instagram channel from a priest that I know that I like a lot. Instagram is a very particular culture of communications, and it might not be for you, but it is one of the ways that, especially for visually oriented people, that you can meet people. So that was the Via Media is the Massage, or Communications in Parish Life. I hope you found it helpful. If you'd like to know more about how to do communications in churches, send me an email, and I'll be glad to answer any questions or point you in the direction of other content that I know about. So thanks again for watching this talk, and explore the Innovative Ministry Center for more resources at www.innovativeministry.ca. I'm Tay Moss. Thank you very much.